prime actors are still states. There are others, we looked at others, right? There are non-governmental organizations, there are transnational corporations, there are transnational terrorist organizations, criminal organizations, all of which have varying degrees of importance, wealth, some of them more important and wealthier than some states, but at the end of the day, it's still the states that are the primary actors. They're the ones that make up the rules. They're the ones that get to say who plays, who doesn't, and how, right? So we looked at a couple of these non-state actors and saw that implicit in all of them was essentially a understanding or an acceptance of the primacy of the states, right? The reason why Apple's going to another country is because they're accepting the authority of the states to tax them, and so now they're going someplace where they can get less of that tax. And then we saw that states have interests. And we looked at a couple of different kinds of interests, right? A couple of different ways you can slice them: enduring, short-term, different ways of categorizing them. We saw that the United States, for example, has 4 enduring interests, and we looked back and saw that regardless of administration, regardless of political party in power, the enduring interests of the United States really haven't changed. You know, maybe happy to glad, small dog, a little puppy, but essentially it's the same 4 major enduring interests that the United States has had since they've started keeping track of this stuff. We also saw that states use power to achieve their interests. And we looked at the elements of national power, right? Defense, informational, military, and economic. And we also, thank you, diplomatic, not defense, right? Just checking to see if anybody's paying attention. Thank you, Chris. And we also saw that power can be applied 2 ways, right? Hard and soft. And what we saw was that in reality, it's not power itself that is hard or soft, but rather the manner of how you apply it. We looked, for example, at the economic element of national power and saw that you can apply it in a hard manner, like sanctions against Iran, or in a soft manner, like most favored nation treaty status with the Chinese. Okay? So different ways of applying the elements of national power in order to achieve the interests which states have within the international security environment. Yes, Sean?
What is that status, sir? Is that an actual treaty that we have with China?
Most favored nation? Yeah, most favored nation status is something that Congress grants to countries, and this isn't really a finance class, but basically the tariff rate that we charge imports from different countries is on a sliding scale depending on how Congress happens to run that scale. And so at the top or bottom, right, lowest rate scale is what's called most favored nation status that we grant to some countries based on, don't ask me what it's based on, I think it's probably in the same logical category as our agricultural subsidy program, meaning incomprehensible to mortals, but somebody somewhere probably makes sense of it. Okay, Canada, for example, has most favored nation status. There's a bunch of them. All right. Anyway, yeah, exactly. So that's what we saw, and what we saw was the act of figuring out how do you use the various elements of national power in what way to achieve your interest is what is known as the art of strategery or strategy, right? Ends or objectives, right? What do we want to accomplish? That's driven by your interests. How are we going to do it? And then means, which is with what? This is strategy, and bounding strategy or bounded by strategy was the concept of risk, which is basically looking at what else can go wrong and making sure that These are balanced. You have sufficient means to do the ways, and the ways are appropriate to achieve the ends, and the ends actually will lead to the attainment of your interests. And if there's any imbalance or mismatch there, right, that's risk assessment, identifying that, and then making a conscious decision about what to do about it. And sometimes that conscious decision means I'm not going to do anything about it because I can't or am not willing to, and so I just accept the risk. Or I can do something to mitigate it. We also saw that there are really two theories on how all of this works: realism and idealism. Basically, realism says that states do unto others before it can be done unto them. Idealism says, hey, states are just like people because they're made up of people, and people are all good, and if we only give them the opportunity and the structure to all get along, then they all will get along. Okay? Two different opposing points of view, and we looked at some of those in how states view their role within the international arena, how they interact with each other, what interests they have, and how they decide to try to attain those interests. And we looked at it, and ultimately we ended up saying, you know, in reality, the United States has had a remarkable continuity, regardless of which particular theory you might think that the purveyors of strategy subscribe to. But we tend to be very idealistic, looking at our United States enduring interests. We tend to be very idealistic in what our interests are, but very realist in how we try to attain those. We also saw that all of this stuff was bounded by culture. We looked at culture from two perspectives. We looked at it from a macro sense, right, like this, and said, you know, some cultures look at all of this in a different way, and what your culture is will inform and impact and influence how you look at the world. Again, we use the example of Confucian China, which did not even take the nation state as a concept, as opposed to the current Westphalian nation state system under which we labor under, right? But we also looked at it from a micro sense, right? How culture affects people. And we looked at culture and looked at all the indicators of it and causes of it and everything, and ultimately ended up at, you know, this is all really well and good, but the reason why we're studying culture is not because we're anthropologists, but so that we can make sure that our military operations are more effective. That's why we're worried about culture, and that's what we call operational culture, which is at the micro sense. How do I make sure that what I'm doing is not going to inadvertently backfire on me or make it harder due to something I don't know about their culture? Or, on the flip side of that, how do I leverage their culture in order to make my military operations more effective? So that's kind of what we looked at there in the opening days of September, mid-September. Then we moved on and looked at, okay, so how does the United States do all of this? And so we looked at the National Security Council process, right? Because it's the National Security Council process that does the strategery for the United States, right? And we saw that, we looked at the law that governs it, we looked at how it actually works, we looked at who does what to who, right? We saw that there were basically four levels, really three. We looked at who the statutory members were, right? Who by law is supposed to be there. We saw that the secretary, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is a statutory advisor to the National Security Council. It's a National Security Council if it's the president who's there, because that's the decision-making body. If the president's not there, but all the other principals are, it's called the Principals Committee, which is the senior interagency deliberative body. And the day-to-day work happens in the Interagency Policy Committee or at the IPC. And we looked at how that works and who's there, and we saw some nice pictures on the board of what the White House Situation Room looks like and all that other cool stuff. Okay? And so this is how the United States, procedurally, right, as written in law, right? National Security Act of 1947 as amended multiple times, and we looked at some of that legislative history and saw some of the changes that had impacted and gotten us to the point where we are today. And then we kind of shifted gears and saw that what the National Security Council does, right, the strategy, they publish a document that's called the National Security Strategy. Whoops. National Security Strategy of the United States. And we saw that from that derives the National Defense Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and then from that, the National Military Strategy, right? This is by the President. This is written by the Secretary of Defense, or signed by, not necessarily written personally by him. And this is by the Chairman. However, we also saw that, I'm just drawing this up here so that you can see it, and that these levels have absolutely nothing to do with these levels here of how the National Security Council is structured. So, which is why this gap between the two boards is there, to ensure that you don't mix those up. Oh, that's pretty good. I hadn't thought of that one before. That's the first time I've done that. Well, I'm going to keep that one. So that's kind of where we are. What we saw was, right, there are actually two national defense strategies, right? There's the one that is required by law, the same law or amendment thereof that established the National Security Council as part of the Quadrennial Defense Review, QDR report. And then there's the sucking foot wound national defense strategy started by Rumsfeld and continued by other secretaries since then, which are not required by law, but they decided they wanted to put a self-standing document out there anyway. The other thing we noticed when we were looking at all these is, the strategy of the United States is more than just what is in the documents, right? The strategy really is, strategy with a small s, right, is really everything that the president says it is. It's all the sum total of all the policies and statements and pronouncements. And we looked at a couple of speeches and we looked at a couple of other additional documents after the National Security Strategy had been published that amend it, that add to it. So it's kind of almost like a living thing, because ultimately the guy who's on the blame line, okay, isn't necessarily constrained by a document that was written 3 years ago. The National Security Strategy of the United States is whatever this guy says it is. The other thing we saw was that because these are all unclassified documents and read by an awful lot of people, right, it's really a form of strategic communication, right? They're trying to say everything to everybody, not say anything wrong to anybody, get certain messages across. And so it's not quite propaganda, because we said that propaganda is not the same as strategic communication. It's not the same as marketing, because marketing is different from propaganda, right? And it's actually no longer strategic communication, because the current doctrinally correct, going back to my earlier rant about using proper language, the current doctrinally correct terminology is commander's communication synchronization. The art is formerly known as strategic communications. Prior to that, propaganda, which is indistinguishable from marketing. But don't call it any of those, because that's not the right word to use. And so because of that, okay, what ends up happening is it needs to get clarified, or rather there needs to be something that will allow commanders to actually execute plans, or to plan in general, right? So what we saw is that the president, actually so far, this is all about policy stuff. What should we do? And in a very large, at the national level, how should we do it? And what we mean by that is, should we use military power to achieve our interests, or should we use economic power, or some combination thereof? Now, once the decision here has been made that it's going to be solved at least partially with military means, okay, we started looking at what the way in which that is done. We saw that the president writes the Unified Command Plan, and what the Unified Command Plan does is that establishes combatant commanders. And we looked at two kinds of combatants. Like that purple joint, huh? After, yeah. I've been practicing. I rehearsed in front of the mirror this weekend and everything. That's right, everything's black and white until that point. And then it's, I don't know, what's the absence of color? Some mishmash of bears and yours. Yeah.
Grayscale, monochrome.
Yeah, all of that. Right, we saw that there were both regional as well as functional combatant commands. And actually, if we can take a quick time out here, what we saw was, how the United States does this. Okay, when we're talking about military and the relationship between the military and society and the military and the government and political leadership, we looked at how that works, and that is enshrined in the United States Constitution. And we looked at how the Constitution kind of sets the tone for what we do, how we act, how we relate to the other other two parts of society. Remember, you can also turn the strategy thing into a Clausewitzian triangle between the people or society, right, between the military or soldiers, and between government. Okay, not necessarily in this same thing, but how that relationship works in our case is governed by the Constitution. And we looked at that, and we also looked at other places where the relationship between these three is completely different than the way it is here in the United States, right? We looked at some countries where the government controls the society, right? Or uses the military to control society instead of the society providing the military, right? Or society making its wishes known through the government. It's the other way around. Anyway, the only reason why we took another detour into the Constitution now is because what we also saw was it's the Constitution that necessitates the fact that it's the president who establishes through the Unified Command Plan the combatant commanders. Because the Constitution doesn't provide for a standing military, only for a navy, but not for a standing army, right? And so if there is no standing army, who's going to implement this? Well, our world has gotten a little more complex since the Constitution was written, and so as his power as commander-in-chief, okay, that is how he uses to organize the military in order to execute the military side of national power. Okay, anyway, so we saw that combatant commanders exist. We looked at the two kinds that do. And we also went back and saw that because these are strategic communication and try to be everything to everybody, you can't really figure out how to schwack bad guys based on what's written here. And so what you need is something that's a little more detailed and something that's more actionable by us military folks. And so what happens is the secretary and the chairman together produce two documents. One is the GEF, and the other is the JSCAP, the Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan, okay, both of which provide additional, more detailed, specific guidance to the combatant commanders for their execution. And if you go back to our little strategy triangle, you can see that the GEF basically provides the ends, and the JSCAP provides the ways and means. We didn't actually look at them because they're classified documents, although we did see some parts of it in the Yukon Theater Campaign Plan, right, that referred to a couple of the unclassified specific objectives that the GEF had. Right, and so the GEF provides end states objectives for the theater that they want the combatant commanders to have, and the JSCAP is what gives the ways and means. And when we talk about ways, what we really mean is specific planning tasks that it assigns the combatant commanders to do in order to achieve the end states that are in the GEF. And we saw that there were two kinds of planning. There was deliberate planning, and there was also crisis action planning. And in deliberate plans, we saw there were two kinds that were directed. One was con plans, or contingency plans, which we said in joint land means a foreseen contingency, as opposed to what we're used to in Army language of, oops, now what do we do? Okay, the oops, now what do we do in joint land is called crisis action planning, which is what we just got done going through with our job exercise. Okay, but the other thing is that the JSCAP and the GEF also require each combatant command to have a theater campaign plan. And basically what we said was the theater campaign plan is nothing more than how does that combatant commander drink beer with his neighbor over the fence so that when it's time to borrow his lawnmower, he'll be willing to let us use it. Okay? A little more involved than that, but we can use the same analogy, right? Because it's how do they engage, how do they build partner capacity so that we don't have to fight alone, and at the same time, execute as many of the phase zero preparatory tasks as possible during peacetime that they're going to need for the contingency plans. And that actually makes a lot of sense because if you remember when we read the National Security Strategy of the United States, it basically said, hey, we're going to do all this with partners and friends, and so Mr. Combatant Commander, here you need to write me a plan that says how am I going to prepare all of our partners and friends to do that which I told you to do so that if we have a problem, we can solve it not alone. All right? So far, so good? The other thing that it provided was the means, and I'm going to kind of draw this a little farther out here because I'm out of room here, right? So we said the GEF provides the ends. The JSCAP provides both the ways, the how, the specific planning tasks, as well as the means in terms of forces. And it did that in a couple of different ways. It apportioned them for planning, it allocated them, it attached them, and actually before that, they could be. Notice I learned my lesson from dealing with you all and had no longer abbreviate the assignment of forces. And so forces could be assigned to the combatant commanders or apportioned to them for planning, right, in terms of capabilities, or it could be allocated to them once it was time to start putting faces to spaces because it looked like we might actually have to execute one of the contingency plans. And then finally the secretary would hack off on the orders book and the forces would actually be attached to the combatant commander, which kind of paved the way to move into C300, which was the capabilities that would be provided. And what we saw was, because up to now so far we haven't talked a whit about any of the military services, because the services don't do anything about deciding what should be done, nor do they do anything in deciding how it should be done, but rather their views and perspectives are represented by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And since we're talking about him anyway, we saw that he's really got three roles, okay? He advises the secretary and the president, right? We saw that it's enshrined in law. Goldwater-Nichols Act is the last that really strengthened his position as the principal military advisor going up the chain, right? In order to be able to do that, he has to make assessments about the state of the union. How are the services doing? How are the military capabilities doing? And then finally, he directs, as in tells the military what to do. What we saw was the JSCAP really is part of the direction. Right? We also saw, look, this guy is not in the chain of command of the combatant commanders. He's really a conduit of information, but what we really ended up with was, you know, his role in the direction part of things is really about like a battalion XO. Technically not in the chain of command of a company commander, but generally, usually, mostly, when the XO tells you to do something, you tend not to say, I don't work for you, I ain't doing it. You can probably do that once. That's about it. All right? So these were the three things, and what we saw was all of this stuff, okay, is called the Joint Strategic Planning System. Basically, the whole how do we run the military and plan the military and employ the military is called the Joint Strategic Planning System, which is an awful big word for an awful lot of various processes and products and everything. Okay? So anyway, going back to the services that provide the capabilities, right? These were provided by services. But we also saw that it's more than just services that provide capabilities for the combatant commander to use in executing the plans that he was told to plan, right? We saw that it's also the interagency. We saw that it's multinational, right? And we saw that it's all the other interorganizational capabilities and stuff that come to play, which incidentally is why in joint operations, we say the principle is not so much unity of command as it is unified action or unity of effort. Because really what this guy is doing is he is herding all of these cats, not all of whom work for him. And what we saw was that the way you make that happen, the place where it happens is the Joint Interagency Coordination Group. And the way you really make it happen is by personalities, which kind of goes back to Clay's leadership class and toxic leadership and all that other stuff, and how you can win friends and influence people when you can't make them do something, but you can kind of hopefully talk them into doing things. So this is kind of the whole joint strategic planning system and how capabilities come from and where capabilities come from. And then, Greg, if I could ask you to move down a little bit because I need the other board. We went to, that's good enough. We went to C400 where we looked at how we plan, how the combatant commanders actually do the planning to do all of this stuff, right? And we said that planning really is of two parts. There is art, which is really the process of design. And then there's also the science of war, which is the JOT process that we all know and love so much. And the art, we said the first step was, what is the current environment? The second step was strategic direction, or what do we want it to look like? What's the end state? The third step was identify the problem. And then the fourth step was develop the operational approach. And what we said was that the operational approach is put together of the various elements of design, not to be confused with the elements of design, not to be confused with the process of design. And so you put the elements of design together into the operational approach so that you can make that problem go away, so that you can make the current environment look like you want your strategic direction. And then this operational approach, in turn, feeds the actual planning process. This is the architect's sketch of the house. this is the detailed blueprints of the electric lines and the plumbing and all that other kind of stuff. What we saw that these two back and forth are really an iterative process, because the first step of JOP is initiate planning. And we saw that the second, starting to run out of spelling ability here. The second step was mission analysis, and we very quickly realized that we have a problem, because one of the things you do as part of mission analysis, and also as step one, right, is JPOA, or the Joint Intelligence Preparation of the Operating Environment. And that JPOA is really what feeds the development of the operational approach, right? You got to figure out what's going on in the world so that you can do this. And then step three, course of action development, is where this operational approach is then integrated. So it's a back and forth iterative approach. And at the end of the day, when you develop your course of action, this is where you take into account all of those things that we learned about, like joint functions, also things like principles of joint operations, and also things like joint force organization, right? How do you organize joint forces in accordance with the principles of joint operations by joint function to actually do something, right? And we looked at this and said that you could do this both in terms of command, what authority you give people, as well as in how you carve up the real estate that joint forces use. And once this is done, that then feeds the military decision-making process, where the force actually figures out how to implement and execute those plans and schwack bad guys.